In this video, I'm going to talk about the value of looking at different games for reference when trying to design the systems in your own game. Now, this is something that I use quite a lot especially when I'm trying to figure out how to make something feel more impactful, or making something feel more responsive, or making something give more feedback to the player that something has happened. So in this example, I am looking at a FPS mechanic. I've never made an FPS before, so this is quite a fun little exercise for myself as well. So this video is going to be kind of two parts. The first part is me breaking down Overwatch and trying to figure out just the general gunplay. And then the second part is I'm going to show my own implementation of a shooting mechanic, mainly based on the findings that I've managed to extract from breaking down Overwatch. So generally what I would do is I might look at several different games. So in this case, I did look at a couple of other games, but there weren't really anything particular in those that I felt would contribute to the feel in combination with Overwatch. So I'm purely looking at Overwatch in this case. So getting started, I am going to look at a couple of visual things first. So the placement of the gun is on the bottom right hand of the screen. It takes up quite a large amount of screen space. If I wasn't studying Overwatch, I probably would have thought, no, like the gun can't take up that much space. It's just getting in the way of things. But no, that's how much space it takes up. There's a green reticle in the middle of the screen, and that doesn't change ever, regardless of whether you hit or miss. That just stays the same. And another thing that's quite important to note is the distance from the barrel of the gun to the green reticle in screen space is about maybe 4 or 5 centimeters. So I'm going to try and put my gun in the same position as well. So looking at actually shooting mechanics, so I'm going to use this wall as reference. So if I stand back about maybe 8 or 9 meters and I shoot this wall, just auto fire, I can see the recoil pattern quite clearly. It kind of goes upwards and it looks something like that. There's a tiny bit of sideways spray, but not very much. Another thing to notice is that if I shoot and I let go of the shoot button without having moved the mouse in that time, the camera actually resets to the starting location. So one more time. If I shoot and move the mouse, then it doesn't reset. So that's quite interesting as well. Looking at actually hitting some enemies. If you hit an enemy, you'll notice a red hit effect at the point of impact, and that only lasts a couple of frames. That's very quick. There's also a white hit marker, like a reticule, that appears at the same location as well, and that stays on screen for a little bit longer. So if I hit and then I move the mouse, you can still see it for a fraction of a second before it fades out. If I hold that down, it grows in size. So the longer you hold it, the bigger it gets, like up to a certain point. If I hit the head, you get a red hit marker as well, so it's a different color, and it's a lot bigger. That's something to keep in mind. And that also expands in size the longer I hold it. If I shoot an enemy, there's a blood spatter. Or it's probably easy if I look at hitting an actual human enemy. So if I hit Tracer in the knee, or the chest, or the head, there's a blood effect that sprays out from the point of impact. And it's also really important to note that regardless of where you hit the enemy from, that blood spatter is always screen facing. So it always sprays out to the left and right relative to the camera. And I find that quite interesting. I believe they've done that to make the profile of the effect quite clear, regardless of where you hit the enemy from. And I think that definitely helps in sort of telling me as a player that I've hit something. And it obviously just looks a lot better as well, because you can actually see the blood spatter. So a couple of other things to note is the audio effect. So if I hit nothing, if I just shoot my gun, you get just the firing sound effect. If I hit the like a body shot, that's like the sound for hitting the body. and then there's a different sound for hitting the head. It's like a higher pitched, like a ring or a ding sound. So again,
get your head down.
hitting nothing, hitting the body, hitting the head. So there's a lot more nuances to the shooting mechanic in Overwatch. Obviously, it's I can't deconstruct it in like 5 minutes, but those things I think are really important. And if I just implement those like 6 or 7 things, then hopefully I can get my system to start working and feeling quite good already. The goal isn't to replicate it 100%. The goal is to base my FPS on something that I know works, especially if I've never made an FPS before, so that I know that I've got something that is quite solid and I can continue working on it. So in the next part, I am going to show the result of my own prototype. This is my implementation of an FPS mechanic. So as you can probably tell, I use Unreal Engine 4 for my personal development. If I run this and full screen it, a couple of things that I just want to quickly go over is things that I didn't do or things that I don't have. So I don't have a reload animation. So when I run out of bullets, I just display a reload bar. My enemies also don't have any hit reactions. So it's something that I didn't mention before is when you hit an enemy in Overwatch, they actually play like a very quick animation, and that just gives the player extra feedback that you've hit them. But my enemies don't do that. And my enemies also don't die, so when you kill them, the health just resets. And another thing to note is that my health bars look and work completely differently to Overwatch, so don't pay any attention to those. I also haven't implemented any sideways recoil. So if I shoot, you'll see that the bullet decals are 100% straight. That's just something that I haven't done, and if I was trying to replicate my system to be more close to the reference, that's probably the next thing that I would do. Now, looking at the things that I did add, so firstly, I've placed the gun at the bottom right hand of the screen, and I've tried to make the size of the gun on screen and the distance from the barrel of the gun to the center green reticule as close to Overwatch as I can. I've added the muzzle flash at the end of the gun. It obviously looks very different, but similar to animations, I don't have access to a whole lot of particle effects. I believe this one is something that I've gotten free of one of the official Epic assets of the marketplace, and I've changed the color of it. I've added the tracer effect coming out of the gun, that line, and a couple of polish things. I added like a hit effect when you hit the wall, and I've added bullet decals on the wall. You gotta have bullet decals these days. So looking at the weapon spread, if I stand about 8 or 9 meters from the wall, similar to when I was testing the gun in Overwatch, and I unload all 30 bullets, full auto, it looks something like that. So it's quite similar, I think. I've also implemented that little mechanic where if you shoot and you haven't moved the mouse, the camera will revert to its starting location. If you shoot and move the mouse, then it won't reset. So similar to Overwatch. Now looking at actually shooting an enemy. So you'll see at the point of impact, there's a red hit effect. And that's very brief, only like maybe several frames. And I also have the white hit marker. It appears at the same time, but it stays on screen for a little bit longer. So if I shoot and move the mouse, you can see that's still on screen before it fades out after a brief moment. And the longer I hold down the shoot button, the bigger that marker gets. I have a different marker for a headshot. So it's red colored and it's quite a bit bigger. So that's a body shot. It's white, it's quite small. Headshot, it's red and it's quite big. Now, I just looked at Overwatch again briefly before, and I think my red marker actually needs to be quite a bit bigger. It's quite big, but I don't think it's quite big enough compared to Overwatch. So I've also added the blood effect. So when you hit an enemy at the point of impact, there's a blood spray, and that is camera facing. So regardless of where I hit the enemy from, that blood is always going to spray to the left and right relative to my camera. Now, this is something that it's things like this that I think it's really useful for looking at other games. I've made a couple of games before where my effects never look quite right. It always looks really good from one direction, but not from others. And I've never really thought about like billboarding my particle effects. But after like learning that Overwatch does this, that's something that I can apply to my own games in the future, even if I'm not working on an FPS. And looking at the sound effect, so that's just my regular gun sound without hitting anything. That's the sound for hitting the body. And hitting the head has a higher pitch, like a ring, or a ding sound. So one more time, hitting nothing, hitting the body, hitting the head. So I think that pretty much covers all the things that I talked about and extracted from looking at Overwatch in the first part of this video. So I'm just going to run around and pretend I'm fighting this enemy just to show how the gunplay would kind of work and if this was like an actual level with enemies. So if I hold down full auto on the head, the recoil will take it too far up. If I burst mode, it's really accurate. If I run up and like strafe around, it looks something like that. If I sort of move a bit further back, fight from a distance, it looks something like that. Yeah, so this is a process that I use, especially if I'm working on something where the played feedback is super important. So another example might be, and I have a lot of examples in combat design, right? So someone somewhere in the history of melee combat design had discovered that if you freeze animations for a couple of frames when you hit someone or something with a sword, then that really adds to the play feedback and the feel of melee combat. Now, the reason is probably because it simulates resistance. So instead of the sword, for example, like slicing right through an enemy that can feel kind of buttery and not very impactful, if you pause it for a couple of frames at the moment of impact, it feels like you're slicing through bone and you're slicing through meat and sinew, and there's a resistance on the enemy that you're hitting, and that gives a very clear indication to the player that you've actually hit something compared to if you miss and the sword just swings freely, right? So little things like that, if you don't kind of look at reference and you don't sort of learn these things, you'll probably never be able to discover it on your own, and you could be struggling for months trying to figure out why your combat mechanic just doesn't feel right. Whereas if you looked at some of your favorite melee games, you might find that they all do this weird thing where it keeps like freeze framing for a couple of seconds. What's all that about? But then if you add it to your own game and it suddenly feels really really nice, then that's something that will save you a lot of time to try and discover on your own. Now, I worked on my FPS mechanic for about 3 or 4 days, and like I mentioned before, I've never made one before. And if I tried to make one without reference and just purely base it on what I think I know about FPS mechanic design, then I'm pretty certain that it's not going to feel anywhere near as nice as it does already. Now it's obviously not really exactly close to actual Overwatch. There's still like a long way to go, but I think just extracting those like 6 or 7 things has given me a really solid foundation to like continue working upon. Now, if I change the impact effect, if I change the color and the shape of the reticule, and if I change like for example the recoil, let's say like I want to make the gun in my game a little bit harder to use, I change a couple of things, and now suddenly it's going to feel completely different from my reference, and it's going to be suited to my game specifically. Um, and but underneath I know that it's based on a really solid foundation because it's based on a game where I know the shooting mechanic is fun and it works. Now, I don't advocate looking at games and copying like entire systems. So, I would never look at a game and copy like a character and all their abilities and everything, because that's more game design. And that really is on you to make that sort of unique for your own game. But this really is for things that I've mentioned several times already. It's about getting impact, the feel, played feedback, feeling really nice. Um, just underlying like details to get your game really satisfying to play. So that's pretty much it for this video. Um, I hope that it's been useful and something that you can potentially apply to your own games moving forward. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching.